The Common Ground Initiative is unique in higher education today. What we're doing is we're trying to provide a forum for people who don't ordinarily agree with each other to be able to come together. And traditionally in America, those forums would be the progressives and you must be a progressive. It had beautiful music coming right in on it. The progressives and the conservatives. And the challenge in the 21st century is going to be, how do we redefine progressivism, if that's your tradition? How do we redefine conservatism, if that's your tradition? But more important than just that, how do we bring those two folks together so that they can search for common ground to deal with all the challenges that we face? Our goal here is not to turn Republicans into Democrats or to turn Democrats into Republicans. Our goal here is to make sure that we prepare a new generation of leaders to work with people in a very culturally diverse setting. People who are going to have very different ideas of what the good life in our society actually entails. That's our goal. Well, here's the plan for the afternoon. Make sure you get all the food you want. We got to eat it because we already ordered it. So please help yourselves. Go back for seconds and thirds. It's not going to be, this is not family holdback night, as we used to say in my grandmother's house. And what I'm going to do is come back at about 12:15, so about 10 minutes or so, and talk to you a little bit about some of the historic examples of common ground. Then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Brenna, and she's going to guide you through a workshop exercise. We'll wrap up at 1:10. At 1:10 we'll pass out evaluations, and that's when you'll get a chance to grade us. You can get back at me. Those of you in my honors class, this is your chance. You can really stick it to me now. You get to grade us, and 1:15 we're free to go. Okay, any questions? Okay, I have just a little question for you as a conversation starter, a little thought piece for you as you're eating. Let me just ask you, is it leadership to rally your troops? If you're a progressive, is it leadership to rally the progressives around you? Don't be bashful. Garrett, you're nodding your head. Yes, it is. There is a legitimate function of leadership to say, okay, for those of us who are like-minded, this is what we need to do. Is it leadership to reach out to those who disagree with you, to do what Bob Quinn at the University of Michigan in his famous book, Building the Bridge as You Walk on It? Is it leadership to reach out to those folks in a democracy? Absolutely. The challenge, and this is the third and most important question, how do you reconcile those two? So we'd be curious to get your answers to that when we start up again in about 10 minutes, okay? Enjoy your meal. Sorry to interrupt your conversations. Please feel free to continue to enjoy the meal, especially those cookies. I've already had about 4 of them and they're delicious. Carb loading is what I call it. Okay, here's what I'd like to do to start out with is ask you if you thought a little bit about the questions that I posed. Leadership, of course, has to do with rallying your own troops. It has to do with reaching out to the others. How do you reconcile those? What ideas did you come up with? Yes, Hannah.
Dr. G, I think that eating together is a good way to kind of break the ice and find common ground. How we did it.
Once again, you and I are channeling the same thought.
I just got a lot going on up here.
Good. Yes. In case, for those of you who aren't aware, this is the honors class over on this side of the room, and Hannah and I decided we channel the same ideas. So, yep, there we go. That's exactly right. And that's why, of course, we had a meal where you could enjoy sharing food together. That is a great way to reach over the aisle because it also gives you an opportunity to talk about very human things. What's going on in your family? Where have you traveled recently? What's a good book you've read recently? Absolutely. Good suggestion. What else did you come up with? Yes, Abby.
I thought getting to know where people come from, kind of like what makes them who they are, because it kind of can help you understand why people believe the way they do. People find some common ground in between, like common experiences.
Common experiences. That's right. Good. And that leads us to biography. I mean, once you start learning about somebody and what they've actually been through, it's hard to attack them as an ideologue or just somebody, they're they're an R, they're a D, or whatever you label them. As soon as you learn what made them that way, I think we start to reach out to others in our common humanity. It takes the edge off, to be sure. Okay, good. I love the suggestions that you're coming up with so far, because this is precisely what happened in Michigan back in 1994 when we had a split House of Representatives in Lansing, where we had 55 Republicans, 55 Democrats, and so you have the leadership asking each other, how are we going to run state government in the House of Representatives when we're exactly evenly split? What do we do with leadership, for example? And the accommodation they came up with worked brilliantly. One party would have the floor debates, control the floor, but the speaker would be from the other party. So that would force people to work together. And then they would switch the next month so that the other party would then have the speakership, but then all the floor procedures would be run by the other party. And what this forced the two leaders to do was go out to dinner together, get their families together, and just relax. Go to a softball game, go see the Lugnuts. Just do things that would be bonding in a human way and not always political. And it meant they could work together. And it's amazing. If you go back and look through the legislative record of that 2-year term, it is amazing what the state got done. And there was a bipartisan spirit, so you did not have the rancor. And this is one of the things that my boss was able to encourage. I was working for him at that time, Governor John Engler. What else have you come up with? The other day? Yes.
Well, like what you mentioned, finding something human to connect, because we get caught up in our ideas and say Republican, Democrat, that finding common ground that reminds you that you're both human and you do have the same general interests at heart kind of promotes the idea that you can set things aside to a certain extent to get through the human things.
Thank you, Connor. That's absolutely right. We have many historical examples of people being able to set apart things that otherwise would divide them. Yes, Hannah.
I think it's important to not only find common ground between the parties, but within a party as well. We saw that in the 2008, I believe, elections in the Republican Party. Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum, before the primaries, really kind of battling it out. But when Mitt found out that Rick had a sick daughter,
Yes.
they really came together and found common ground.
That is an excellent point. It's harder to attack somebody once you establish that kind of common ground. Very, very good. Well, in U.S. history, and I don't have time to go through the examples in any detail, but let me just touch upon 3 examples in U.S. history where people found a way to reach across the aisle and work with people in other parties, and also addressing Hannah's point, when people had to work with difficult folks within their own party. I always start by going back to the Declaration of Independence that's crafted out of the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress has people with an amazing array of worldviews. I think people nowadays think, oh, well, they were colonials, they all believed the same thing, they were all Christians going to the same church, but not at all. Au contraire. The founders, you had skeptical deists like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who did not necessarily believe in a God that, say, you would see in the churches around here, all the way over to Trinitarian Christians, Quakers, Unitarians, people who had very different ideas about how the universe is actually put together and what's the divine being, if there's one at all, that governs us today. So you had somebody like Franklin or Jefferson as a skeptic, certainly an agnostic, expected to deal with a John Dickinson who's a Quaker, who doesn't have quite the same vision of the Christian God that a lot of people do in our churches, versus a John Witherspoon who's actually a minister. How do you get these people to agree on anything of huge importance, especially when it comes to the nature of what the human person is? And yet that Second Continental Congress found a way to overcome their differences and produce one of the most important documents in human history, but not because they all came from the same starting place. Indeed, there were a lot of debates in there, in the Second Continental Congress, over whether to have a revolution or not. So if we go back and look at the historic example, we see a lot of telling information, a lot of insights into what people actually are are having to reconcile with others. Then moving swiftly to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The most contentious issue of the Constitutional Convention was what to do with slavery. You had at one point toward the end of the convention, when people's nerves were already frayed, you had one contingent of Northerners who were abolitionists and said, how can we ever form a union with people like from South Carolina who are slave drivers, slave owners? How can we do that? This contention was only set aside when the delegates were able to step back and say, look, I think everybody in this room realizes that slavery is a great scourge on our country's conscience and eventually will have to die out. Our generation is not going to have that opportunity to make it happen, though. So we're going to have to set aside the question of whether African Americans are human beings deserving of the rights that all people should have. We're going to set that aside in order to form a more perfect union. Now, that was one of the great great problems with the Constitution, is that issue was not settled. It would have to be settled in a terrible civil war. But in terms of forming a country that could settle the question, it had to get there first. And that's what the delegates were able to do, North and South, even though they had such diametrically opposed views. Third and finally, just being very brief, you probably heard the famous term, it's what our title is today, Team of Rivals. This comes out of Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, about Abraham Lincoln and how he was able to make it to the presidency, first of all, by defeating a lot of his opponents within the Republican Party. And I mean opponents who viciously attacked him, hated him. They accused him of being a coconut head, for example, of looking weird. The poor man had Marfan syndrome. He looked weird because he was diseased. He had been diseased all of his life. So he had to overcome that, but there were vicious editorial cartoons, vicious speeches about him. Edwin Stanton, our Secretary of War, was a radical Republican who I don't think it would be too much to say hated Lincoln, thought he was an inferior creature, had no business being President of the United States. What did Lincoln do? He said, you know what, Mr. Stanton, I need you to come into my cabinet. I want to work with you. Lincoln was able to separate any personal feelings there for the sake of the country, in the same way that people at the Second Continental Congress put aside personal thoughts and feelings about, a whole host of issues, creating the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitutional Convention also put aside personal feelings toward one another in order to work to form a more perfect union. Well, that gives you three examples from American history that I think stand. It makes these examples part of our political DNA as Americans. And they are always great to go back to when you have a question, when you have a challenge of working with people with whom you disagree. And I mean disagree in a substantive way. Go back and look at the founders at the Second Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention, and at what Lincoln did in his forming a cabinet of people, in some cases, who hated his guts. And look at the lessons we can learn. They are astounding, and they're for the ages. Well, at this point, I'd like to turn our workshop over to Brenna Cleary, who will guide you through an exercise. Brenna?
Yeah, so Glees just gave you 3 examples from American history, and what we're going to ask you to do now is we're going to give you about 15 minutes to, at your tables, I'm probably going to ask a few of you to shift this way just to even out the numbers, to think of examples from your personal life, from politics that you've seen recently, maybe an admired friend, parent, who you've seen work with people who disagree with them. How did they do it? What worked? And also, what were some common pitfalls of leadership? And just to kind of get you guys thinking, I'm going to give you an example. Recently, Forbes published an article about a study where leaders in times of stability tend to be very good about reaching out across the aisle and looking for help. In times of crisis, leaders tend to think of their own position above that of the group, and they stop looking for the advice of other officials who know what they're talking about because they're so worried about their position in the leadership. So one common pitfall of not looking across the aisle, not seeking the advice or working with someone who disagrees with you could be self-interest above group interest. So just a little something to get you guys started. We're going to give you about 15 minutes, and then we're going to do a group report back to try and generate a good list so you guys can leave here with a list of things to seek common ground. So if I could ask a few of you guys to move to this table just to even out the numbers. You can bring drinks, food, paper, whatever.
Leave the cookies for me, though.
All right, I hate to break up great conversation, but I want to bring this back to the group. So what we're going to do is have maybe one spokesperson from each table to kind of report back on the best things that you guys talked about. And then with the remaining time, just any additional comments before we go our separate ways today. So why don't we have this table start? Here's
I don't mind being the spokesperson, but I feel like I've spoken a lot. Okay. My name is Sheila, and our group had a lot of different things going on, but we thought it was a little bit difficult to find times when common ground was actually reached and moved forward. Sometimes you just learn a lot about each other but don't actually get anywhere. So some of our best examples were from Simone. She talked about there's a pastor in Chicago who is trying to tackle a big problem of gang violence by using a small solution, and that is he created a center, correct me if I'm wrong, created a center where they have basketball games on a regular basis, but the only rule is that you cannot have anyone on your team who is also part of your gang. So it forces them to play together, and then it sounds like one of the best things from that is when they're out in the street, if they have a dispute, then they say, well, they have another place to go to settle that. That, well, we'll settle that on the court. And that's really cool. And then we had another example, just the last one of Apollo 13, the movie, and of course when all of the items were dumped on the table and those sleepy engineers had to like figure out who's good at what and figure out how to get something up there to people who can't even see what they're doing. And then we also talked about Lansing and how sometimes if you ever have the opportunity to go and witness, the only thing that happens all day is there's a birthday party and everybody separates to have cake, and we think we should force them to eat their cake together. And we had a number of examples of people like not just learning about each other, but in other countries too, having to force, who's good at what and get the job done that way. So that's what came from our table.
great. Thank you for sharing. We go to this table.
Our table shared mostly personal stories. I'd like to share a candid story about Connor Daly and myself. In first semester, Connor was the only boy that I sat next to in Honors 280 Section 18. And I would always ask him, how's your day going? Or he would be late, and I'd be like, oh, do you have a class for this? And he would never respond. He would never say anything. So there's a really big divide between Connor Daly and I. Connor is the one in the tie. And, so it was I was like, what do I do? We're on the opposite spectrum of just about everything, even hair length. He's got ear size, everything. So finally, he had mentioned in casual conversation with someone else, because he never talked to me, that it was his birthday coming up the next Thursday. He liked chocolate cupcakes. So I brought him in some chocolate cupcakes from a gourmet cupcake shop, and then I led the class in singing happy birthday to him. And then finally, 2 weeks later, he thanked me for the cupcakes. And now we're the best of friends. We rode to the meeting together today, and we have a lot of inside jokes. So it was a successful common ground. So then Abby had shared a personal story of a soccer team that was really divided, and the leader in the group was unable to bring them together because he actually divided them. So there was no chance for common ground. So two very drastically different situations, but sometimes you just have to sing happy birthday and brings people together. So maybe if the Congresses that are divided brought in some cupcakes, had a celebration.
Make them eat together.
Yeah.
That's from both of your tables. It sounds like, sharing a meal and also sharing personal stories are two big themes that you guys have discovered. And also for the basketball team and the soccer team, one tip that we've used before is common enemies create common cause. And that doesn't have to be as sinister, as drastic as the Cold War where everyone was united against Russia. It can be the enemy of a situation is not making a deal or not getting done what you need to get done. And that can be the group's enemy. So whether, it's something as obvious as the Russians or it's something as subtle as we need to pass a budget, the enemy is not getting it done, it can force people to work together if you have that common cause or common enemy.
I feel the same way.
What about from this table?
Okay, I'm the only non-student spokesperson. We talked about often an issue in not achieving common ground is that you misperceive meanings and people aren't clear about what it is they're talking about, and everybody walks away having derived different meanings from the conversations. And of course, we talked about what everybody else did about if you're familiar, that you have a better understanding of where people are coming from, and the role of respect and humility in all of this and achieving common ground, because if you have a great deal of respect from somebody, it's not going to divert into, oh, they're stupid or ignorant or anything like that. And we also talked about how important it is to not take disagreements with you. If somebody disagrees with what you're saying, to not take it too personally, to really listen and understand that it's not about you, but that it's more about ideas. And we also talked about an example that you heard on NPR of Ray Robinson, who
he was an activist that wanted to put together the Indian movement and the Black movement when the Indian movement had seized Wounded Knee. He didn't succeed, but he knew that that was the right moment to put two movements together and fight for a similar cause. And for me, that's a really good leadership, that he knew that he could have been killed, and he was in the moment of harvesting and back in home in Georgia, and he left everything behind, and he just went there because he knew it was the right moment.
Thank you. Does anyone have any additional comments or hear something that they want to expand on?
I liked what you said about sometimes the issue is not. Many times the issue is a misinterpretation, or it's not a personal thing. Don't take the disagreement personally. I was recently at UICA with a discussion about leadership, and Mayor Hartwell was there, and Megan Saul from the Right Place made this comment, and at the time, none of us really took it, and then afterwards we've all been talking about it, but at the time, people say things and you just don't, it doesn't register, but she said, they asked people to talk about what their views of leadership, and she said one of her views of leadership when it does involve conflict is that she's been trained that it's not a conflict of people, but that it's just people with different goals. So if I learn what your goal is, and I think if that were my goal, what would be the easiest way or what would be most helpful to me to reach my goal, then maybe we can all meet the goals. Instead of saying like, every time I try to get my thing passed, she blocks me. Instead of saying like that, I say like, what is it that you really want? What is your goal in all of this? And when I learn what your goal what your goal is in all of this, then maybe the two of us can accomplish everybody's goal and not even know it. So yeah, don't take it personally, because that's the quickest way to just stop all the movement.
Yeah, I agree. I've heard that described as arguing outcome versus arguing value. So if you look only at what a person's outcome is, you might be missing what they value or why they want that to happen, and there can be more potential places to work together if you're looking at what really is motivating the two separate groups. Anything else to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of goes along with the same concept of, misconception, premature cognitive closure, like closing off your mind to another person before they can really speak their mind and describe to you why they're trying to reach a certain point or consensus. So just really keeping an open mind throughout the whole process instead of going in thinking that the way that you're thinking is going to be the only or the best solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what Gleaves was talking about earlier, is that you need to rally the people who think like you, but you also need to be able to reach out to the people who have differences of opinion, because that's really where the better solutions and the compromise is going to come from.
I guess another way to find a common ground is when you know that, for example, you have a conflict of interest, which is going to make this harder to find the common ground, and know when to step out, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else people would like to add to our conversation? No. Well, thank you very much for coming today. We have evaluations for you on the table that we ask that you fill out. If anyone has any questions about anything that was discussed or any common ground issue, Gleaves and I will be right here. Also, any future Hauenstein Center events or any questions involving that, we're here to answer. So have a great afternoon.